So if you were placed in a completely empty room for 15 minutes with absolutely nothing to do, but there was this button on the table that delivered a painful electric shock, do you think you'd press it?
I mean, it sounds totally absurd, right?
Yeah.
But there was this famous 2014 University of Virginia study that actually ran this exact experiment. They stripped away all the phones, all the books, like zero distractions.
Yeah.
Yeah, the participants just had to sit there with their own thoughts.
And the results from that are just completely wild. I mean, a quarter of the women and two-thirds of the men chose to voluntarily shock themselves rather than just sit in silence.
Which is terrifying.
Right. One guy actually shocked himself like 190 times in 15 minutes. We would literally rather experience physical pain than be left alone with our own minds.
Yeah, and that underlying terror of our own internal dialogue is really well, it's the invisible architecture driving so much of our daily exhaustion. I mean, we wake up and immediately the defense mechanisms just kick in.
You grab the phone, right?
Exactly. We grab the phone to flood our brains with dopamine, and then we hit the chaotic commute. We react to tense emails. We consume these endless streams of content. We spend the entire day aggressively avoiding silence.
We really do.
And by the time we finally collapse into bed, our nervous systems are completely fried.
Okay, let's unpack this because, I mean, if you are constantly feeling overwhelmed by information, if your baseline state is just this low-grade anxiety
Yeah.
and you feel like your emotional state is, entirely dictated by the people around you, well, we are going to build a functional defense system today.
Just really need to.
Yeah, we are taking the underlying psychology of how our brains process external threats and basically mapping out a very specific three-part daily routine. And I want to be clear, this is not generic self-help,
No, definitely not.
right? It's a biological framework to reclaim your cognitive autonomy. So morning, noon, and night, welcome to today's deep dive.
Thanks. And, to build that defense system, we really have to start at the foundation, which means tackling the morning routine. And the first step is confronting that University of Virginia study head on. We have to learn how to inhabit an empty room without reaching for the shock button, which, I mean, in our modern context, is usually the smartphone.
It's so true. We really do treat being alone like a psychological emergency. Like
Yeah.
if you see someone sitting at a restaurant just staring into space or taking a walk without headphones, the immediate cultural assumption is that something is terribly wrong.
We pity them.
Exactly. We view it through this lens of loneliness, like they're totally isolated.
But that conflation is really where the trap begins. We confuse loneliness with solitude, but neurologically and psychologically, there are just entirely different states.
How so?
Well, loneliness is an involuntary state of deficit. It's this distressing perception that your social needs aren't being met, right? And that triggers a stress response in the brain that's actually really similar to physical hunger.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. But solitude, on the other hand, is a voluntary regulated state. It is the intentional restriction of external input.
So like loneliness is starving, but solitude is fasting.
That is a brilliant way to frame it. Because when you deliberately fast from external input, something fascinating happens in the brain. You activate what neuroscientists call the default mode network, or the DMN.
To DMN, right?
Yeah, and this is basically the brain's internal processing center. When you are distracted by a screen or a conversation, the DMN is largely suppressed. But when the room goes quiet, the DMN powers up.
Which I guess explains why the quiet feels so incredibly uncomfortable at first. I mean, when we turn off the audio or put down the phone, we aren't just magically experiencing peace,
Not at all.
right? We're suddenly hit with this massive backlog of unprocessed thoughts, like the argument you had 3 days ago, the anxiety about your mortgage, the existential dread about your career path.
It's a lot.
It all just floods in at once because the brain finally has a processing power to deal with it.
Exactly. And the discomfort you feel is just the sensation of your brain doing its filing. But because it feels uncomfortable like an itch, we instantly interrupt the process.
We reach for the phone.
Right. We turn on the TV for background noise. We text a random friend. We basically pipe in other people's voices to drown out our own internal filing system.
Which is so damaging.
It is, because when you chronically suppress the default mode network, you actually lose the ability to synthesize your own experiences. Your identity blurs. You stop knowing what you actually want.
Because your internal monologue is entirely overwritten by the opinions and expectations of, well, your coworkers, your family, or just influencers on the internet.
Yes. So the morning routine has to be about clearing that cognitive backlog before the world even gets a chance to dump new data into your brain. The framework here requires forcing yourself into deliberate solitude.
Okay, so what is step one?
Step 1, take yourself on a 20-minute coffee date or just sit at your kitchen table with absolutely zero inputs. I mean, no phone, no book, no music.
I can already feel the anxiety just thinking about that.
Oh, the initial sensation will absolutely be a spike in anxiety. Your brain will scream for a distraction, but you have to sit through that initial friction.
And then step two is the silent walk.
Right. 30 minutes in nature, no headphones. You are actively training your nervous system to tolerate the backlog. You let the thoughts bubble up, you let the DMN do its filing, and eventually the noise just settles.
That makes a lot of sense.
And what's fascinating here is the downstream effect this has on your social autonomy. When you push through that discomfort and actually clear the cognitive backlog, you discover that your own baseline state is incredibly peaceful.
Yeah.
And once you realize that sitting alone in silence is a high-value state, your entire tolerance for interpersonal drama just collapses.
Oh, that is so true, because you stop saying yes to obligations you hate. You stop tolerating toxic friendships just to avoid being alone in your apartment on a Friday night because, you no longer fear the empty room.
Exactly, you've neutralized the threat.
So you've essentially established your baseline, you wake up, you clear the cognitive RAM, you find your footing. But then, inevitably, you have to leave the house. You have to open your inbox.
The real world calls.
Right. You commute. And the second you do, you are stepping into an environment designed to pull you completely out of that baseline.
Which brings us to the daytime routine and the mechanics of navigating a high-stimulus environment. Because throughout the day, you are going to encounter friction. A passive-aggressive comment from a manager, a driver cutting you off in traffic, a really frustrating email.
Yeah, it's unavoidable.
And the default human response to these stimuli is immediate emotional reactivity.
But hold on. I really need to push back here for a second. Because whenever we talk about, not reacting, it sounds dangerously close to just submitting.
I hear that a lot.
Right? Like if a coworker actively disrespects me in a meeting, or my boss sends an email totally throwing me under the bus, and my response is to just sit there taking deep cleansing breaths. I am literally training them that they can walk all over me. Doesn't non-reaction just make you a doormat?
I get why it feels that way. It definitely looks like passivity from the outside, but internally it is the exact opposite. We have to separate the concept of internal resource preservation from external capitulation.
Okay, explain that.
Well, when someone attacks you or a high-stress event occurs, your brain undergoes an amygdala hijack. The amygdala, which is the threat detection center, just floods your body with adrenaline and cortisol.
Right, the fight or flight response.
Exactly. And it physically reroutes blood flow away from your prefrontal cortex, which is the logical, forward-thinking part of your brain, and sends it to your limbs.
So you are biologically compromised in that moment. Your IQ essentially drops because the logical processor is literally starved of oxygen.
Yes. And acting while biologically compromised is exactly how you destroy your own life, because yelling back at that coworker or, firing off a defensive, angry email, that takes about 5 seconds to execute.
But the fallout is massive.
Huge. The HR meetings, the damaged reputation, the weeks of lingering tension that will drain your cognitive energy for months. So non-reaction isn't about letting people abuse you. It is about refusing to engage while your prefrontal cortex is offline.
You can still address the disrespectful coworker.
Exactly, but you do it 4 hours later when you have full access to your strategic faculties.
That reminds me, the famous psychologist Viktor Frankl talked about this perfectly. He survived the unimaginable horrors of the concentration camps, and he observed that between a stimulus and a response, there is a space.
Yes, a crucial space.
And in that space lies our freedom to choose. So when you react instantly to a trigger, you completely collapse that space. You basically allow the other person's dysfunction to remotely control your nervous system.
And to prevent that remote control, the daytime routine utilizes a biological override mechanism. We can call it the 5-second fortress.
The 5-second fortress, I like that.
It's highly effective.
Yeah.
When the trigger hits the bad email, the rude comment, your only job is to physically count to 5 while breathing deeply.
It sounds almost insultingly simple. Just count to 5.
It does sound simple, but the simplicity hides a really complex biological mechanism. Deep, rhythmic breathing actually activates the parasympathetic nervous system, which signals to the amygdala that your physical environment is safe.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and counting requires focus, which physically forces blood flow back into the prefrontal cortex. You are literally manually overriding the hijack.
You are prying open the Viktor Frankl space.
Exactly.
And once that space is open, the next step of the daytime routine is a perspective shift,
Yeah.
right? You have to decouple your identity from the event. Like instead of being the victim of the traffic jam or the bad meeting, you force a cognitive detachment.
And a highly effective way to do this is to run the event through a specific filter question. You just ask yourself, will the outcome of this specific moment matter to my life in 1 year?
If the guy cutting me off in traffic won't matter in a year, he doesn't get my energy today.
Precisely.
If the snarky comment on a group chat won't matter in 12 months, I am not funding it with my cortisol.
Because energy is a finite currency. Every single day, you wake up with a limited amount of cognitive bandwidth and emotional resilience. You need that currency to build your career, to foster deep relationships, to maintain your physical health.
Getting furious at a stranger on the internet is basically like setting a $100 bill on fire.
Exactly. The daytime routine is simply a financial strategy for your nervous system. Do not spend expensive, irreplaceable energy on cheap triggers.
Okay, so we have protected the morning by clearing the cognitive backlog, and we've defended our energy currency during the day using the 5-second fortress. So the system is working, you get home, you feel regulated.
You sit on the couch.
Right, you sit on the couch, you finally relax, you pull out your phone, and within 5 minutes, your nervous system is in complete crisis again.
Yep.
And it's not because of a direct threat, but because you've opened the back door to the most insidious psychological trap of all.
The comparison trap. This is the entire focus of the evening routine. Because to understand why scrolling through social media at night is so destructive, we really have to look at the evolutionary biology of how the human brain calculates status.
Right, because our brains definitely didn't evolve to process the internet. They evolved to process small tribes.
Exactly. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans lived in localized groups of about, 150 people. Your survival absolutely depended on your standing within that specific group.
You had to fit in.
Right. So the brain developed this background algorithm, like a prediction machine, that constantly scans the environment to calculate your relative rank. Are you pulling your weight? Are you falling behind? But historically, you were only comparing yourself to the hunter or the gatherer sleeping in the next tent.
So the data set was incredibly small and, more importantly, realistic.
Yeah.
You were comparing yourself to normal, flawed people living in your exact same environment.
But today, that ancient prediction machine is still running, and we are feeding it catastrophic data. When you sit on your couch and scroll, you are injecting the extreme outliers of 8 billion people directly into your brain's algorithm.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because the data isn't just vast, it's completely fabricated.
Exactly.
The prediction machine doesn't know about photo editing or staging or survivorship bias. It just sees endless images of 22-year-old billionaires, fitness models, and couples on luxury vacations.
And so the algorithm just breaks. It takes all that outlier data, processes it as the new normal for your tribe, and immediately calculates that you are in absolute last place.
Even though you're fine.
Right. You are sitting in a safe, comfortable home, but your brain triggers a profound biological stress response because it genuinely believes you have been left behind by the pack.
This perfectly explains why you can feel completely satisfied with your life at 7:00 p.m. And by 7:15 p.m., you feel like a total failure. I mean, your reality didn't change one bit. The only thing that changed was the false data you fed the prediction machine.
And this creates two highly dangerous psychological distortions. First, it induces a state of artificial scarcity. You become completely blind to your own resources.
What do you mean?
Well, you could have a supportive partner, a decent income, and good health, but the comparison algorithm renders those invisible simply because someone else has a private jet.
Wow.
Theodore Roosevelt famously observed that comparison is the thief of joy, but biologically speaking, it's more accurate to say comparison is a hallucination.
A hallucination that forces you to abandon your own life. And that's really the second distortion, isn't it? When you feel like you were in last place, you panic. You start chasing goals that you don't even actually care about.
Exactly.
You just say you need to work 80-hour weeks to afford a luxury car. Not because you love cars, but because the broken algorithm is just screaming at you to raise your tribal status.
And you end up sacrificing your physical health and your actual lived relationships just to acquire props for a performance.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it becomes obvious that trying to run someone else's race is a mathematical impossibility. I mean, life is not a standardized test with a universal scoring system. You might see someone who achieved massive financial success at 25, but you aren't seeing the crippling anxiety attacks they suffer off camera.
You never see the whole picture.
Right. You might feel behind because you are 30 and changing careers, but that pivot might lead to a decade of deep, quiet fulfillment that
Yeah.
the 25-year-old never even experiences.
You just cannot borrow someone else's timeline without inheriting their invisible burdens. So the final step of the daily routine, the evening defense mechanism, is about deliberately recalibrating your brain's prediction machine back to reality.
And how do we do that practically? I mean, you can't just tell your brain to stop comparing. It's hardwired.
You're right, you don't stop the comparison algorithm, you change the data set. Before you go to sleep, you remove the global outliers from the equation and substitute the only metric that actually exists. You ask yourself, did I operate with more integrity today than I did yesterday? Did I manage my reactions slightly better today than I did a week ago? You shrink the tribe down to a population of one.
So the only valid comparison is longitudinal, you against your past self.
Exactly. When you constrain the algorithm to your own historical data, the panic subsides. You aren't falling behind the pack because there is no pack. There is only the trajectory of your own development.
So what does this all mean for the listener? Well, we've dismantled the chaos and built a comprehensive, biologically grounded defense system for your day. It starts in the morning by deliberately seeking out silence.
Right.
You fast from the noise, let the default mode network clear the cognitive backlog, and establish a baseline of peace so you don't spend the day desperately clinging to distractions.
Then, as you move through the day, you fiercely protect your energy currency. When the inevitable friction occurs, you deploy the 5-second fortress.
You count to 5.
Yeah, you manually override the amygdala hijack. By breathing, you pull blood flow back to the prefrontal cortex, and you objectively filter out the cheap triggers that won't even matter in a year.
And finally, as the day ends, you close the back door. You refuse to feed extreme fabricated outlier data into your brain's evolutionary algorithms. You shut down the highlight reels, reject the artificial scarcity, and measure your success exclusively against who you were yesterday.
And this raises a really important question. It is the reality we have to confront if we want any of this to actually work.
What's that?
The modern world is engineered to keep you in a state of constant low-grade panic because a panicked brain is highly profitable. It clicks, it buys, it reacts.
The friction, the comparison, the noise, it's all attacks on your autonomy.
So the final thought to sit with long after this audio stops is this. If you cannot learn to tolerate the silence of an empty room, you will inevitably outsource your entire personality to the loudest voices around you.
Wow.
Your fears, your desires, and your reactions will simply be programmed by whoever controls the feed. If you strip away the cheap triggers and the tribal comparisons, well, whose life are you actually living today?
And if you finally cut the noise, what might your own voice actually sound like? Take back your bandwidth. We'll see you on the next deep dive.